In the quiet places of your life, the moments when no one is watching, no one is applauding, and no one is asking anything of you, heaven leans in. There is a soft stirring, a whisper that does not rush, does not demand, does not shout, yet somehow it reaches the deepest part of you. It calls to the places you've buried, the wounds you've learned to hide, the fears you've tried to outrun. You've been carrying so much, more than anyone knows. And even now, as you breathe, there is a gentle shift in the unseen, as though God Himself is brushing His hand across the dust of your heart, making room for something new. You don't have to strive right now. You don't have to fix anything. Just listen. Let the weight slide off your shoulders. Let your spirit catch its breath. Let your soul remember that it was crafted by a love that has never failed and never will. For in this moment, something sacred is unfolding, a turning, a lifting, a recognition. The pain you've survived, the prayers you whispered, the nights you endured, none of it was wasted. You are standing at the threshold of a shift you didn't see coming, but have always been destined for. God is near. God is speaking. God is awakening something in you that cannot be shaken. Stay till the end, share this message, and remember, when God speaks, your life begins to change. There is a moment, quiet, almost breathless, when life slows to a stillness you didn't choose. You stand in front of a door you prayed would open, a door you pressed your hopes against, a door you reached for with trembling faith, and yet it does not move. You feel the weight of your own heartbeat, the ache of disappointment settling into your chest like a stone. It is in that silence, before the mind begins to reason or the heart begins to defend, that something sacred begins to unfold. A stillness you didn't ask for becomes a place where God draws near. You wonder if you misheard Him. You wonder if you failed Him. You wonder if this closed door is some hidden sign of divine displeasure. But beneath those fears, deeper than your doubt, there is a gentle assurance rising. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, doesn't push. It simply waits for you to notice. You begin to sense that God has not abandoned you in front of this refusal. He is standing beside you, watching over you, guarding you from stepping into something your heart wasn't ready for. Pain has a way of narrowing your vision. A closed door can feel like an ending, like a loss, like something in you wasn't enough. But when God closes a door, He is not taking something from you. He is rescuing you from what your eyes cannot yet understand. There are battles behind certain doors that would have broken you. There are paths that seem harmless but lead your spirit into shadows. There are opportunities that sparkle with promise but drain the life out of you once entered. You can't see those things clearly, not yet. But He sees every unseen edge. He sees every trap wrapped in beauty. He sees every burden disguised as blessing. And so He closes the door. It hurts, it feels unfair. But slowly, gently, in the hush that follows heartbreak, He begins to open your eyes. You start to see how easily you trusted your own timing, how desperately you clung to what felt right, how quickly you assumed that what you wanted must be what God wanted. A closed door becomes the mirror that reveals your own striving. It shows you the places your heart was running ahead of His wisdom. It reveals how much you tried to build your life on your understanding instead of His guidance. You begin to notice the weight you were about to pick up, a weight God never designed you to carry. You see how tired your spirit was, how rushed your steps had become, how loudly your fears were speaking for you. And in that slow dawning of clarity, you realize the closed door was not rejection at all. It was protection. It was mercy. It was God saying, I love you too much to let you walk into what would wound you. It is in these moments, these quiet endings, these halted plans, that surrender becomes more than a word. You feel your grip loosening, not because you gave up, but because your heart grows wise enough to trust. You start to understand that faith is not proven when everything opens. Faith is proven when God blocks the way you want it and you choose to believe He is still good. In the stillness, you discover something else, something deeper. You realize God is not asking you to understand the closed door. He is asking you to follow Him away from it, to let Him lead you toward a place you did not expect, a blessing you didn't know to pray for, a future that isn't shaped by your fear, but by His promise. The door before you may be closed, but the path beside you is widening. It is gentler, it is safer. It is guided by hands that have never once failed you. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, your vision shifts. You begin to see the fingerprints of God where you once saw only disappointment. You see how He shielded you, how He redirected you, how He preserved you. What once felt like loss begins to feel like love. What once felt like abandonment becomes evidence of His nearness. You understand now that He was never withholding good from you. He was guarding the good in you. The closed door stands behind you, still locked, still silent. But your heart is different now. It no longer aches with the same desperate questions. It rests quietly, steadily in the truth that God is not finished with you. A closed door is not your ending. It is the doorway into deeper trust. It is the beginning of eyes that see beyond the moment, beyond the pain, beyond the limits of your understanding. You walk forward not because everything makes sense, but because you've learned that God's no is often the first step toward His greater yes. You walk forward because your eyes, once clouded by longing, have been opened by wisdom. You walk forward because you finally understand when God closes a door, He is leading you into something better, something safer, something shaped by His love, not your fear. And in that gentle realization, your heart finds peace, not the peace of understanding every detail, but the peace of knowing you are protected, guided, and held by the one who sees the whole path when you see only the next step. There is a stillness that settles over you before you even recognize it as God's doing. It comes in those quiet hours when the world seems to move without you, when every prayer feels suspended in the air, unanswered and untouched. You feel the ache of waiting, heavy, slow, stretching longer than you ever imagined. It is in that muted space where nothing seems to shift that God begins to draw near in ways you can't yet perceive. The silence feels like distance, but it is actually the beginning of something deeper. You look around and see others stepping into opportunities you hoped for. You watch doors swing open for people who didn't pray as hard, didn't dream as fiercely, didn't carry the same longing in their chest. Their progress feels like a reminder of your own delay. Tightens with questions you never wanted to ask. You wonder if God has forgotten you, overlooked your tears, or turned His attention to someone more deserving. But beneath that uncertainty, something quieter is happening. An unseen work that has nothing to do with punishment and everything to do with preparation. Delay is the place where your faith is stripped of its illusions. It's where your hopes are tested, not to break you, but to strengthen what lies beneath them. You begin to see how much of your trust was tied to your timing, how tightly you held the schedule you built for your own life. You didn't realize how much you were depending on your clock until God gently took it from your hands. In the space left behind, He begins shaping you, not through movement, but through stillness. Waiting exposes the tender places of the heart, your impatience, your fear of being forgotten, your desire for control, but it also reveals something else, the quiet endurance God planted in you long before you knew you would need it. The delay becomes the ground where that endurance grows roots. You start to breathe differently, not because the wait is easy, but because you begin to sense that you are being held through it. You realize that what feels like immobility is actually God slowing your steps to match the pace of His wisdom. In this pause, something shifts. Your prayers lose their desperation and gain sincerity. They move from asking for answers to asking for strength, from begging for movement to trusting the stillness. You start to understand that God isn't keeping you waiting to punish you. He is keeping you close enough to shape you. He is guarding the parts of your life that are not yet ready to hold what He intends to place in your hands. And then, somewhere in the midst of that surrender, a revelation rises. You begin to see how dangerous it would be to receive the blessing too soon. You realize how easily your spirit could have been overwhelmed, how quickly your heart might have been consumed by pressures and responsibilities you were not yet prepared to carry. The delay becomes a shield, protecting your purpose from collapsing under the weight of premature arrival. God does not withhold blessings out of reluctance. He withholds them when the foundation within you is still forming. He knows what the blessing requires. He knows the strength it demands. He knows the character it will call out of you. And so He waits with you, patiently, intentionally, faithfully, because He desires not just to give you the promise, but to ensure you can sustain it once it comes. There is a quiet shift that happens when you finally surrender the urgency. Peace doesn't arrive suddenly, but it settles like a soft layer over your spirit. You begin to breathe again, not in frustration, but in trust. You no longer see the delay as a barrier, but as a companion walking beside you, guiding your steps into deeper clarity. You recognize that God has been working in the unseen all along, shaping the future you've been praying for with hands that know precisely what you need. And through this slow revelation, something else begins to awaken within you. Hope. Not the fragile kind that depends on perfect timing, but the grounded kind that believes God is moving even when you are not. This hope doesn't rush. It doesn't demand. It simply trusts that the one who began the work knows exactly when to reveal its fullness. Eventually, you reach a place where the delay no longer feels like a prison, but a quiet room where God and your soul have learned to walk in rhythm. You see how the waiting changed you, how it deepened your patience, strengthened your character, and awakened a resilience you didn't know you possessed. You understand now that the delay was not an interruption to your life. It was the very thing that prepared you for it. And in that quiet understanding, something within you loosens. The weight lifts not because everything has arrived, but because you finally accept that what is meant for you cannot be taken, cannot be rushed, cannot be lost. It will arrive exactly when God knows you are ready to receive it. Then gently, almost imperceptibly, the renewal begins. You find yourself standing taller, breathing easier, trusting deeper. The delay hasn't ended yet, but its hold on your heart has. You walk forward not with frustration, but with faith, knowing that divine timing is not late, not careless, not cruel. It is precise, it is protective, it is personal. And as you rest in that truth, you discover a quiet assurance rising in your spirit. An assurance that softens your fears, calms your questions, and steadies your steps. You realize that delay is not denial. It is the slow, sacred unfolding of a plan crafted with love, carried with wisdom, and revealed in perfect time. There are moments when your heart grows unusually quiet. Moments when the absence of someone you once held close becomes the loudest sound in your life. You sit with that emptiness and wonder how something that felt so necessary could suddenly be gone. You trace the memories, the conversations, trying to understand where things shifted. It feels like loss, like something sacred slipped through your fingers. But beneath the ache, beneath the confusion, something deeper begins to take shape. It is the gentle truth that God has moved someone out of your path not to wound you, but to protect the peace you didn't realize was slipping away. You didn't lose them. God lifted them. And while your heart tries to make sense of the separation, heaven is already breathing relief into places that were slowly suffocating. You felt the heaviness but learned to carry it. You noticed the storms but convinced yourself you could endure them. You held on because letting go felt like failing. Yet God saw what you refused to acknowledge: the strain in your spirit, the quiet draining of your joy, the subtle dimming of your strength. He saw how much of you're sacrificing just to hold on to someone who no longer belonged to your journey. Pain comes first. It always does. It arrives like a tide, pulling you into questions you don't know how to answer. You wonder why things ended the way they did. You wonder if you could have tried harder, loved better, forgiven more easily. You wonder if the separation is a reflection of your worth. The ache pushes into the deepest parts of your heart, pressing you to believe that something valuable has been torn from you. But in that deep ache, God begins the quiet work of unbinding your soul. He lets the emptiness remain just long enough to loosen your grip on what you were never meant to hold. He lets the silence linger long enough for you to hear your own exhaustion. And little by little, the pain begins to reveal what peace once tried to whisper. Some people are not meant to stay, not because they are bad, but because their season in your life has reached its holy ending. Surrender follows, slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. You begin to realize that holding on would have cost more than letting go. You see how your heart bent itself into shapes it was never meant to hold. You see how often you silenced your own needs to maintain peace that wasn't truly peace at all, just temporary calm built on your own self-sacrifice. The surrender isn't about giving up on someone. It's about giving in to God's protection. It's allowing Him to do what you weren't strong enough to choose for yourself. You begin to see the patterns you missed when affection blinded you, how the relationship drained your energy, how the conversations grew hollow, how you felt smaller, quieter, less seen. You remember the nights you cried in secret, telling yourself things would get better. You recall the moments you felt alone even while standing right beside them. These memories don't arise to hurt you. They rise to free you. God brings them back not to reopen wounds, but to show you what He has delivered you from. And then comes revelation, gentle but undeniable. You realize that God did not take something from you. He took something off of you. The weight you thought was normal suddenly feels foreign when lifted. You wake up one day and notice the air is easier to breathe. You find your thoughts uncluttered, your spirit calmer, your heart quieter. You don't feel fully healed, but you feel yourself returning to yourself. And that alone is a sign of divine intervention. People are not removed from your life without reason. Some were stepping stones meant to help you see your own worth. Some were lessons sent to teach you boundaries you once lacked. Some were mirrors reflecting the parts of you that needed strengthening. And some were storms revealing just how deeply you needed God's protection. Their exit was not punishment. It was preservation. God saw what their presence was costing your soul long before you were willing to admit the truth. Peace begins to take root in the space they once occupied. The more you breathe, the more you understand, the more you reflect, the more clarity comes. You start to see how God shielded you from heartbreak that would have grown heavier with time, how He redirected you before disappointment deepened, how He whispered the truth in moments of stillness, even when you weren't ready to listen. And slowly, renewal rises, quiet, steady, and sure. Your heart begins to heal in ways you didn't know it needed healing. You rediscover parts of yourself that were buried under compromise. You feel the strength of God holding you where another's presence once weakened you. You walk with a steadier step, not because everything makes sense, but because you know you are no longer walking with a weight that was never yours to bear. You realize now that God did not remove them to punish you. He removed them to restore you. He removed them because your spirit was crying out for peace you could not find on your own. He removed them because He loves you with a love too deep to let you settle for half light, half truth, or half peace. The separation was the doorway to your healing. The loss was the beginning of your freedom. And in the quiet conclusion of this journey, something inside you settles. Not a shout of victory, not a loud declaration of strength, but a deep, steady assurance. You understand now that God's hands have always been in your life, guiding, protecting, and lifting what needed to be lifted. You see that the absence you once feared was actually the opening your soul needed. You feel peace, not fragile, not temporary, but real. You didn't lose them. God removed them to restore your breath, your strength, your clarity, your peace. And now in the stillness that remains, you finally recognize it. This is what your soul was waiting for all along. There comes a time when life grows painfully quiet, when everything familiar fades and you find yourself standing in a landscape that feels barren and unfamiliar. The things that once comforted you no longer reach you. The voices you depended on grow distant. The plans you trusted fall apart in your hands. You wake up each day with a hollow ache, wondering how you ended up in a place where nothing seems to move and nothing seems to grow. It feels like exile. It feels like abandonment. But beneath the surface of that emptiness, God is beginning a work that could never happen anywhere else. The wilderness is never accidental. It is the place where God draws you away from the noise so He can speak to the parts of you that would never be quiet otherwise. While you feel stripped, He is removing what cannot follow you into your future. While you feel emptied, He is creating space for what your next season will require. The wilderness is not God turning away from you. It is God turning you toward Him. But in the beginning, all you feel is the loss. Pain arrives first, heavy and uninvited. You feel it in the silence that replaces the comfort you once had. You feel it in the loneliness that sits beside you when night falls. You feel it in the uncertainty that haunts your steps. There are no easy answers in the desert. No shortcuts through the ache. It forces you to face the parts of yourself you tried to outrun, the fears you buried, the questions you silenced, the trust you thought you had but now realize was fragile. The wilderness uncovers everything, and yet slowly the surrender begins. Yet, not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender that happens when your strength runs out and you realize you cannot navigate this season by your own understanding. You stop trying to drag old comforts into new terrain. You release your grip on the things that once made you feel secure, but now have no power here. You find yourself whispering words you never expected to say. That you need God, not in theory, but in truth. Not in quiet convenience, but in desperate honesty. The wilderness strips you of illusion until trust is the only thing you have left to hold. It's in that surrendered silence that revelation starts to rise. You begin to sense that God has not abandoned you at all. He has removed every competing voice so you could finally hear His. In the quiet, His guidance becomes clearer. In the emptiness, His presence becomes more real. You start to see what He was protecting you from, what He was strengthening in you, what He was preparing you for. The wilderness exposes the cracks in your faith, but it also reveals the foundation God has been building beneath your life. Solid, steady, unshakable. You begin to understand why certain doors didn't open, why certain people drifted away, why certain plans unraveled before they had a chance to begin. What felt like punishment was actually protection. What felt like loss was actually God redirecting your steps. The wilderness forces you to rely on strength you didn't know you had, because God planted it long before you knew you would walk this path. Every day you survive here, you discover something new about the endurance He crafted into your spirit. It's a strength that doesn't rely on circumstances, a courage that doesn't crumble under pressure, a faith that learns to stand even when nothing around you seems stable. And then, renewal begins in the smallest ways. You feel it in your breath before you feel it in your circumstances. A quiet peace settles where fear once screamed. A steadiness grows where anxiety once ruled. You find yourself able to face the day without the weight you used to carry. You begin to notice how deeply you've changed, not because the wilderness ended, but because you learned how to walk through it with God rather than without Him. The wilderness does not end with a dramatic breakthrough. It ends quietly, almost gently. One day you realize the emptiness is gone. The heaviness has lifted. You feel grounded, rooted, strengthened in ways you couldn't have imagined before the journey began. And you understand now that you were never being punished. You were being prepared. You were being equipped for a chapter that requires clarity, resilience, and faith you could not have developed in comfort. The desert was the place where everything unnecessary fell away until only what was eternal remained. It was the place where God reshaped your heart, refined your endurance, and restored your identity. And as you step out of that season, you carry with you the quiet, unshakable truth that the wilderness was never meant to break you. It was meant to build the version of you that God always knew you could become. And in that realization, your spirit rests. Not in victory shouted loud, but in assurance held deep. You survived the desolation, not because you were strong, but because God was near. The wilderness did not destroy you. It prepared you, and now you carry its lessons as the quiet strength that will guide your next steps. There are moments when the quiet around you feels almost unbearable. You kneel to pray, and the words leave your lips. No comfort returns. You cry into the dark, waiting for the smallest sign, and all you hear is your own heartbeat. You search the heavens for movement, but everything remains still. In those moments, a heaviness settles into your chest. Not just sorrow, but a deep question you're almost afraid to voice. Where is God? The silence feels like distance, like the invisible space between what you need and what you cannot reach. But silence is not absence. It is a different kind of presence, one you cannot recognize at first because it does not come wrapped in the familiar sounds of comfort. It comes as a stillness that unsettles before it strengthens. It comes as a pause that feels like waiting but is actually God rearranging what you cannot yet understand. The silence is purposeful, but in the early stages, all you feel is the weight. Pain comes first, and it arrives quietly. Not the loud pain of sudden loss, but the slow ache of unanswered prayers. You begin to question your own faith. You wonder if your words have fallen flat. You wonder if your tears matter, and deep down you wonder if God has stepped away from you, but He hasn't. The silence is not a withdrawal, it's a shift, a holy recalibration happening beneath the surface of your life. You begin to notice things you once overlooked. The quiet forces you to sit still long enough to feel what's happening in your own heart. You see how frantic your thoughts have been, how rushed your decisions felt, how easily you filled every space of your life with noise. Conversations, distractions, plans, fears, assumptions. Without realizing it, you had grown accustomed to movement, to answers, to signs. And now God is slowing you down, not to frustrate you, but to clear the clutter that disguised itself as clarity. Surrender begins here. In the stillness you didn't choose. At first it feels like defeat. You want to fix what you can't control, force what won't move, or reach for certainty that doesn't appear. But eventually your strength wears thin, and the quiet becomes the only place left to rest. You stop demanding answers and start whispering the only words your tired heart can form. Help me trust you, even when I hear nothing. This surrender isn't forced, it's formed. The silence molds it, shapes it, deepens it. And then slowly revelation begins to rise. Not as a thunderous moment, but as a steady understanding. You realize that silence is not a sign of God doing nothing. It is a sign of God doing something too intricate to reveal prematurely. He is aligning people, shifting circumstances, preparing paths, softening hearts, and opening doors you don't even know exist yet. If He spoke too soon, you would run ahead. If He showed you too much, you would misinterpret it. If He answered instantly, you would never grow roots. Silence becomes the space where God builds what you will later call miracles. You begin to sense His strategy, not in details, but in the way your heart slowly steadies. You feel a peace that does not match your circumstances, a calm that does not come from understanding, but from trust. You start to realize that God's silence is not empty. It is full of protection, full of timing, full of preparation, full of things being placed exactly where they need to be before He releases them into your life. Eventually, the quiet turns into something different. It becomes the place where your faith matures. You no longer need constant reassurance. You're no longer panicked when answers don't come. You begin to walk with a quiet confidence, not because everything is clear, but because you know God is near even when He does not speak. The silence itself becomes evidence that He is working with a precision far beyond what your heart could have orchestrated. And then renewal begins, softly, like a dawn that breaks without sound. A door opens that you never expected. A solution appears without noise or warning. A burden lifts in a way you could not have planned. You look back and realize that the silence was not wasted. It was the very ground where your breakthrough was being cultivated. God wasn't ignoring you. He was arranging your steps with careful, measured timing. He was preparing outcomes your prayers weren't yet large enough to hold. You understand now that if God had spoken sooner, you would have settled for less. If He had answered immediately, you would have missed the greater work He was doing inside you. His silence was strategy, an act of love disguised as stillness. And in that understanding, your spirit settles, not with loud celebration, but with a deep, steady assurance. You feel God's nearness more profoundly now, because the silence has ended, but because you have learned to recognize His presence even within it. The stillness no longer threatens you. It grounds you. God's silence was never His absence. It was His careful, deliberate way of guiding you toward a future He crafted with precision, protection, and love. And now, as your heart rests in that truth, you finally see the beauty in the quiet you once feared. There are moments when the weight of what you feel becomes almost unbearable. You sit with the pieces of your life scattered around you. Plans undone, relationships fractured. Hopes that seemed so certain now collapsed into dust. You look at the brokenness and feel something inside you sink, as though this is the place where everything ends. You wonder how something in you could shatter so deeply and still leave you breathing. You fear the breaking has buried you beneath a sorrow too heavy to rise from. But the truth begins in the quiet. It begins when the trembling slows and your tears settle into a stillness you did not choose. In that stillness, God draws near, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a presence that begins to soften the ache you couldn't escape. You don't feel healed. You don't feel restored, but for the first time you feel seen. And that small, almost imperceptible shift is where the real work begins. Pain arrives first, raw and unfiltered. You feel it in the places you kept guarded from the world. You feel it in memories that resurface without warning. You feel it in the dreams you buried because you no longer believed you deserved them. Brokenness has a way of revealing everything you tried to hide. It strips you of your strength, exposes your wounds, and forces you to confront the truth that you cannot mend yourself. You thought the breaking would end you. You thought it meant you failed. You thought it meant you were too fragile to hold the life you hoped for. But slowly, quietly, the breaking begins to show itself as something else. It reveals the parts of you that needed healing, the parts that were cracked long before your heart finally gave way. It uncovers the wounds you learned to live with, the fears you buried beneath busyness, the insecurities you masked with strength. Breaking doesn't destroy you, it uncovers you. Surrender comes next, not as a choice, but as a necessity. When you have nothing left to hold on to, you finally loosen your grip on what was never meant to sustain you. You stop pretending you're strong enough to carry the weight alone. You stop running from your own emotions. You stop insisting that you can piece yourself back together without help. In the surrender, your heart opens, not in defeat, but in honesty. You tell God the truth you've hidden even from yourself, that you are tired, afraid, and unsure of how to begin again. And it's in that raw confession that revelation begins. You realize that every shattered piece is not evidence of failure, but an opening for God's light to reach places it never could before. You see that the parts of you that broke were the parts that needed to be rebuilt. You understand that the breaking wasn't the end, but the beginning of a healing you couldn't have chosen on your own. Brokenness becomes a doorway, not a grave. You feel something small rising inside you, not triumph, not confidence, but a quiet awareness that something sacred is happening beneath the sadness. You start to see yourself differently, not as someone ruined, but as someone being remade. Not as someone defeated, but as someone undergoing transformation. The breaking becomes holy because it draws you back to the God who never once let you fall beyond his reach. Renewal begins slowly, the way morning light softens the edge of night. You notice that the heaviness doesn't crush you like before. You find moments of peace in places where only sorrow lives. You begin to rebuild not quickly, but faithfully. And in that rebuilding, you discover parts of yourself you never knew were there. Strength you didn't recognize, resilience you didn't expect, faith that feels less like words and more like breath. You start to understand the truth you couldn't see in your darkest moment. What felt like an ending was actually the birthplace of purpose. The story you thought was closing was simply turning a page. God was not burying you beneath the weight of brokenness. He was planting you in a place where new life could take root. He was clearing away what could not sustain your future. He was preparing the foundation for something deeper, stronger, and more true. You feel it now, the shift from what you were to what you are becoming. You see how the breaking freed you from things you didn't realize were holding you back. You recognize how God used the cracks in your heart as pathways for his presence. You feel the quiet courage growing in the spaces that once felt hollow. Brokenness didn't define you, it refined you. And in the stillness that follows, you find yourself resting, not in answers, not in certainty, but in assurance. The kind that wraps around your spirit like a gentle hand. You realize you survived what you thought would end you. You realize the breaking did not bury your purpose, it birthed it. And now every step you take carries the quiet strength of someone who has been remade by God's hands. You are not ruined, you are being rebuilt. You are not finished, you are becoming. And the very place where you thought your story ended is now the place where God is writing something new. There are seasons when your heart runs hard after things that shine, dreams that sparkle with promise, people who seem to carry the answers you long for, paths that look smooth from a distance but hide their thorns up close. You chase them with sincerity, believing that if you can just reach them, everything in you will finally settle. But each time you reach out, something stops you. A door closes, a plan collapses, a hope dissolves in your hands. You feel the sting of disappointment, wondering why God keeps pulling you back from the very things you thought would make you whole. Yet beneath that ache, something deeper is happening. You don't see it at first. All you feel is the loss of what you wanted, but God sees what you cannot. He sees where each desire leads. He sees the weight hidden beneath the glitter. He sees the quiet destruction behind the beauty. And so he steps between you and the lesser things. Not to deny you joy, but to protect you from what would have consumed it. Pain arrives first, sharp and confusing. You look at the closed doors and see only rejection. You replay the moments where everything seemed within reach, only to slip away before you could claim it. You wonder if you misheard God, or if he has grown silent toward your dreams. The disappointment presses into your chest, heavy enough to make you question your own worth. You don't understand why he would let you desire something so deeply only to take it out of reach. But slowly the surrender begins. Not because you feel ready, but because your heart grows too tired to keep forcing what won't move. You loosen your grip, not willingly, but honestly. You admit that you don't understand the no, and you stop pretending you do. In that surrender, something shifts. It isn't a relief, it isn't clear. It's simply the soft awareness that you cannot outrun God's protection, even when you don't recognize it as such. And then, revelation rises like a slow dawn. You begin to notice things you missed before. You see the cracks in the things you once desired. You recognize the subtle warning signs that your heart in its longing brushed aside. You realize that what you wanted wasn't built to hold the weight of your hopes. You see now that the people you reached for did not have the capacity to cherish your heart. You understand that the paths you tried to enter would have led you further from peace, not closer to it. You realize that God wasn't withholding something good. He was shielding you from something that would have quietly drained your strength. His no wasn't punishment. It was mercy wrapped in disappointment. It was love disguised as loss. And slowly renewal begins. Not in your circumstances at first, but in your understanding. You start to trust that God's denial is never random. You begin to see that every disappointment held a hidden rescue. You feel a calm rising within you, a calm that doesn't come from getting what you wanted, but from knowing you are being protected even from your own desires. Something inside you shifts from frustration to faith, from confusion to confidence. From longing for what you lost to trusting what God is preparing. Then, without fanfare, you begin to see the difference between what you wanted and what you truly needed. You notice how much lighter you feel without the weight of chasing what wasn't meant for you. You recognize how your heart is healing in the spaces where disappointment once lived. You realize that God's protection extends far beyond your understanding, into the unseen, the unknown, the parts of your future He has already arranged. You discover that His no has always been connected to a greater yes. A yes to your well-being. A yes to your peace. A yes to the future He crafted with care. A yes to the blessings that won't harm you. A yes to the people who will honor the depth of who you are. A yes to the purpose that fits your soul. What once felt like rejection now feels like rescue. You understand now that God keeps you from the lesser so He can lead you toward the lasting. He denies the temporary to make room for the eternal. He blocks the harmful to make space for the holy. And in that understanding, a quiet assurance settles into you. You no longer fear the closed doors. You no longer resent the unanswered prayers. You no longer cling to what glimmers but cannot nourish you. Instead, you trust the God who sees what you cannot. You trust His hands, His timing, His wisdom, His protection. You see now the mercy hidden in every moment you once questioned. And your heart finally rests in the truth that God doesn't protect you from love. He protects you for it. He doesn't withhold life from you. He keeps you from the things that would steal it. And in that sacred calm, you realize you were never being denied. You were being guided toward exactly what you needed. There are moments when you stand before something new, and instead of excitement, all you feel is the tremble beneath your ribs. The opportunity looks bigger than you expected, heavier than you imagined, and more uncertain than you feel ready for. You see the door, but your hand won't move. Something in you whispers that stepping through might cost more than you can bear. Your comfort, your familiarity, your sense of control. And so you linger in the hallway, telling yourself you're simply waiting on clarity, when deep down you're wrestling with fear. You're not alone in that wrestling. Every person who has ever walked into something meant for them has felt the weight of hesitation. The human heart clings to what it knows, even if what you know has kept you small, even if what you know has quietly drained your spirit. You've prayed for breakthrough, for direction, for purpose, but when God finally places a doorway in front of you, a doorway He shaped with your name in mind, fear convinces you to pause, to question, to retreat. You assume the fear means you're not ready. But sometimes fear is simply the sign that you're standing at the threshold of something holy. Pain shows up here, not as loss, but as the ache of leaving behind what once felt safe. You grieve the familiar, even when it no longer fits. You mourn the version of yourself who didn't have to stretch, trust, or risk. You feel the sting of all the memories tied to the life you're preparing to outgrow. This grief can confuse you. It makes you wonder if stepping forward is wrong. It makes you doubt the very prayers you once prayed. This ache is not a warning. It is the natural cost of becoming who God has been shaping you to be. And slowly in that tension, surrender begins. Not the surrender of giving up on the dream, but the surrender of letting go of your fear. You start to realize that courage has never been the absence of trembling. It's the willingness to move even while you tremble. You whisper a quiet yes to God, not because you feel strong, but because you trust the one who is strong. You stop asking for the fear to disappear and instead ask for the strength to walk anyway. In that quiet surrender, your heart shifts, it steadies, it opens, then revelation begins to rise. You start to see that the very door you feared might actually be the doorway God has been preparing you for all along. You notice how past struggles strengthened you for this moment. You recognize how past disappointments taught you discernment. You remember how seasons of waiting rooted your patience and deepened your trust. The fear you felt wasn't evidence of inadequacy. It was evidence of the weight of what God has prepared. Big blessings often come wrapped in responsibility. Sacred opportunities rarely come without stretching. But everything God calls you into, He equips you to walk through. You begin to see how heaven fortifies certain doors. How God aligns timing, strengthens your spirit, softens your heart, and prepares your surroundings. You may have feared the door because you misjudged your own readiness, but God has been shaping you long before the door appeared. What you see as risk, He sees as destiny. What you see as uncertainty, He sees as fulfillment. What you see as overwhelming, He sees as perfectly measured for the person you are becoming. And then renewal begins, quietly but unmistakably. You feel something waking up inside you, a courage shaped not by confidence in yourself, but by confidence in God. A resolve that does not silence fear, but speaks louder than it. You lift your head, you take a breath. And the door that once intimidated you begins to look different. Not smaller, but clearer. You start to sense that stepping through it is not only possible, but necessary. You realize that if you stay in the hallway, you'll never taste what God has been preparing. If you cling to what is familiar, you'll never grow into the fullness of who you were made to be. If you wait until every trace of fear is gone, you'll wait forever. Courage is found in motion, not certainty. It is born the moment your trembling hand reaches for the handle anyway. It is strengthened when your foot crosses the threshold. It is confirmed when you find yourself standing in a place that feels strangely right. Like your spirit has known all along that this was waiting for you. And in the quiet realization that follows, peace begins to settle. You understand now that the door was never meant to intimidate you. It was meant to invite you. God wasn't testing your fear. He was proving your readiness. He wasn't expecting perfection. He was guiding your willingness. The very door you hesitated to approach is now the place where you sense His presence the strongest. You thought the fear meant stop, but heaven meant go. And as you stand on the other side, looking back at the hallway you once clung to, something deep within you rests, not a loud victory, not a triumphant shout, just a quiet, steady assurance that God led you here, strengthened you for here, and prepared here long before you arrived. The door you feared was not a threat. It was a calling, and stepping through it has become the beginning of a chapter your heart was created to live. There are seasons when the healing you long for does not arrive with sudden relief or dramatic change. Instead, it comes softly, almost secretly, in ways you barely notice. You go to bed with the same ache, the same questions, the same heaviness, and you wake up wondering if God has heard anything you've whispered in the dark. Healing feels distant, restoration feels delayed. And your heart wonders how much longer you must carry what has already weighed you down for so long. But God often begins His deepest healing in the places no one sees, not even you at first. It happens beneath the surface, in the quiet chambers of your spirit, where wounds have lived longer than you care to admit. He moves gently, carefully, touching places you thought were too bruised to bear His hand. There is nothing loud about it, nothing dramatic, no signs that would convince the watching world that anything is changing. Yet slowly, quietly, something begins to shift inside you. Pain comes first, not as a punishment, but as a reminder of what still needs His touch. You feel the old memories, the old losses, the old disappointments rise again, unwelcome but persistent. You wonder why God would allow you to feel them if He intends to heal them. But that resurfacing is not cruelty, it is exposure. Healing cannot begin until the wounds you've hidden are brought into the light. And so He draws them gently to the surface, not to hurt you, but to free you. At first, you resist. You wonder why everything feels heavier before it feels lighter. You question whether you will ever feel whole again. But in that confusion, surrender begins. You stop pretending you're fine. You stop pushing your emotions aside. You finally allow God access to the parts of you that have remained guarded for years. This surrender is not loud. It arrives like a quiet release, the kind that loosens your clenched hands and softens the fear around your heart. And then revelation begins, slow, steady, unmistakable. You start to notice that the things that once triggered deep pain now hold less power. You realize you can think about what happened without feeling crushed. You find yourself breathing easier in moments that once left you tight and defensive. You notice that the bitterness you held has softened. The resentment has started to dissolve. The unforgiveness you carried like armor begins to crack. You see now that healing is happening, not with fireworks, but with faithfulness. God's work in you is quiet because it is thorough. He is not interested in temporary relief. He is after transformation. He tends to the roots, not just the symptoms. He strengthens what was weak. He restores what was broken. He rewrites the stories you believed about yourself. He rebuilds your confidence, not in yourself alone, but in His presence within you. And while no one else can see the process, heaven sees every moment, every tear, every prayer, every step forward, every step back. None of it is wasted. Renewal follows, not as a sudden breakthrough, but as a steady awakening. Your spirit begins to feel lighter, your thoughts clearer, your heart more open. You find yourself responding differently to situations that once overwhelmed you. You look in the mirror and see resilience where you once saw ruin. You catch yourself laughing again. Real laughter, not the strange smile you used to offer. You feel hope rising, not because everything is perfect, but because God has been quietly mending what you thought would remain forever broken. And then in His timing, God begins to lead you into rooms you once felt unworthy to enter. Opportunities appear that align with your renewed strength. Relationships emerge that honor the healed version of you. Paths open that require the resilience He has been building in private. It feels strange at first, standing in places you once feared you would never reach. But as you stand there, something becomes clear. Your healing was always leading you here. This is when the public revealing begins. Not as a performance, not as a display of perfection, but as the quiet confidence of a life restored. People notice the peace in your presence. They see the strength in your eyes. They hear the depth in your words. They sense that something in you has been rebuilt from the inside out. Your scars do not shame you anymore. They speak, they testify, they whisper of what God has carried you through. You realize now that the private healing was necessary. If God had revealed you before He restored you, the weight of your calling would have crushed what was still fragile. If He had opened doors before your heart was whole, you would have entered them wounded and unprepared. He healed you quietly so that when He brought you forward, you would stand strong, not pretending, not hiding, not fractured, but whole. And as this truth settles gently over your spirit, calm assurance rises, not loud, not triumphant, just steady and deep. You understand now that God's silence was not abandonment. His slowness was not delayed. His hidden work was not neglected. It was love, careful, patient, intentional love, shaping you for the very places He is now leading you. The restoration was private. Now the purpose is becoming visible. And your healed heart is finally ready to carry what He always intended to give you. There are seasons when life seems to pause around you, leaving you standing in a stillness you never asked for. You pray for movement, for direction, for answers, and instead you receive a single word that presses against your spirit with a weight you can't shake. Wait. It doesn't come wrapped in comfort. It doesn't sound holy. It feels like heaviness settling into your chest, like your life is being held in place while everything around you keeps moving forward. You don't feel chosen. You feel restrained. Waiting at first feels like a loss. You watch others step into opportunities you longed for. You see doors open for people who didn't pray as hard, didn't endure as much, didn't seem as desperate for breakthrough. You feel overlooked, forgotten, sidelined. And beneath the frustration, deeper than the disappointment, there is a quiet ache, an ache that whispers, "Is something wrong with me?" Has God stopped moving? You don't want to doubt, but the stillness presses hard against your hope, yet the truth of waiting is nothing like what you fear. Waiting is not punishment. Waiting is not abandonment. Waiting is preparation disguised as silence. When God says await, He is not withholding your future. He is strengthening the foundation beneath your feet so you can stand firmly in what He is preparing to give you. But you cannot see that at first. You only feel the weight. Pain shows up here, not sharp, but slow. A heaviness that lingers in your spirit. You grow tired of repeating the same prayers, tired of imagining the same breakthrough, tired of feeling like your life is on hold. You want something to shift, anything to change, but nothing does. And in that stillness, your heart begins to wrestle with the reality that you cannot move God's hand by force or urgency. That wrestling is where surrender begins. Surrender in waiting is different from surrender in pain. It is not the release of what has broken you. It is the release of your own urgency. You let go of your timeline. You loosen your grip on the version of life you were determined to build. You stop fighting the stillness and begin to breathe inside. This surrender is subtle. It does not come with a final sigh or a grand moment. It appears in small shifts. The way you pray, the way you hope, the way you begin to trust without demanding answers. And then revelation begins to awaken softly at first. You start to see how the waiting is shaping you. You notice strength forming in places that once trembled. You realize how much endurance is being built each day you stay faithful without seeing results. You recognize how clarity arrives when your heart finally stops running ahead of God. Waiting becomes the place where you learn to stand without needing constant reassurance, to trust without constant signs, to believe without immediate reward. You begin to understand that waiting requires courage. It is easier to rush into something unready than to stand still until God says move. It is easier to build your own path than to trust the one you cannot see. But waiting becomes the furnace where God forges the resilience your future will demand. He uses the slow days, the quiet hours, the unanswered prayers to strengthen the parts of you that would have buckled under pressure. He knows what the next chapter asks of you, and He is building that version of you now. Then renewal begins, quietly, imperceptibly, like a seed pushing through soil long before anyone sees the sprout. You wake up one morning and realize your heart feels steadier. You feel a sense of peace that doesn't match your circumstances. You find yourself no longer desperate for immediate answers, but anchored in the belief that God's timing is not late. It is precise. You feel lighter, not because the waiting ended, but because the waiting has changed you. You begin to see the purpose woven through every delay. You realize you needed this time to heal wounds that hadn't fully closed. You needed space to release old fears. You needed the stillness to hear God more clearly. You needed the delay not as a denial, but as a safeguard, protecting you from stepping into something before your character, strength, and discernment were ready to hold it. And as this understanding settles into your spirit, something inside you rests. Not because you finally have the answers, but because you have grown into someone who no longer fears the silence. You learn to trust the hands that hold you still. You understand that the wait was never empty. It was full of shaping, strengthening, refining. Full of God's careful preparation for the weight of the blessing ahead. One day the waiting will end, the door will open, the clarity will come, the breakthrough will arrive. And when it does, you will step into it with a strength that does not collapse, a faith that does not waver, and a heart that is not easily shaken. You will enter your next season as someone capable, grounded, and ready. And in that quiet realization, you understand the truth your waiting has been whispering all along. The wait was not wasted. The wait was where God grew the version of you that could carry what's coming.